stressing that the evolution of the Internet calls for a related evolutionary change of the Internet governance. It is in this framework that the multi-stakeholder model needs to be adapted to the new Internet environment. And here it comes particularly useful the concept of variable geometry, which I will address later. Now, let me point out very briefly that the technological and economic environment of the Internet has dramatically changed since the mid-90s. Today, the Internet is much more diverse and dynamic than in the past. The main changes include, first, the increase in the number and diversity of end users. Second, the increase in the diversity and the intensity of applications. Third, the increase in the variety of access technologies. And fourth, the emergence of more complex business relationships among the players in the Internet ecosystem. In sum, the Internet has become a key and global infrastructure, much more complex than in the past. Having said that, we can note that the evolutionary transformation of the Internet has made more complex its global governance. So there is a relationship between the evolution of the Internet and the evolution of the governance of the Internet. For instance, some issues like privacy and cybersecurity are now at the forefront of the global debate, whilst some other more traditional issues, such as the coordination of the Internet technical infrastructure, call for a timely and effective globalization of ICANN and IANA functions. These are only examples of the changes that are required in the Internet governance. Now, in addressing the evolution of the Internet governance, I wish to be clear, as Telecom Italia, we fully endorse the preservation of the multi-stakeholder model, which, however, should co-evolve with the Internet, with the evolution of the Internet. In particular, we need to recognize that relevant stakeholders may vary from issue to issue. It is exactly the concept of variable geometry. Therefore, what is needed is a better match between governance issues and relevant stakeholders. On the one hand, while all stakeholders need to participate in the multi-stakeholder model on equal footing, however, we need to recognize that one stakeholder or a coalition of stakeholders could take the lead according to the nature of the governance issue at stake. In other words, we believe that a multi-stakeholder model based on the concept of variable geometry, it is the right response to the increasingly complex global Internet governance. It can assure both the preservation of the main features of the current multi-stakeholder model and, at the same time, its evolutionary change. By the way, I wish to note that such an approach is also fully consistent with the recommendations of the Panel on Global Internet Cooperation and Governance Mechanisms, formed through a partnership between the ICANN and the WEF. In fact, the collaborative, decentralized Internet governance ecosystem, which is advocated by this panel, is essentially an application of the variable geometry concept. In this case, it is also articulated in terms not only in terms of governance issue, but also at the geographical level. So the concept of variable geometry needs to be addressed both at the level of issues as well as at the level of geographies. Having said that, I would like now to be a bit more specific and express my view on the implementation of this variable geometry model. I believe that we need to be aware that an area of issues requires the active involvement of. In these areas, governments have a special responsibility, not only at the national level. Indeed, it is of the utmost importance that shared rules and are also agreed at the regional and global level. In addition, harmonization of the regulatory framework in these areas across countries is essential in the second area of global internet governance, which includes a number of technical and economic issues that should continue to be primarily addressed by the private sectors. Two examples. First, industry develops standards, promote interoperability and competition while also allowing for innovation. So standards should remain an area mostly addressed by the private sector. Second example, internet interconnection agreements should be left to commerce, and we simply say that this is an area that should remain in the domain of commercial negotiations between players. However, let me also add that these new business models that may emerge may also include the provision of interconnection services of differentiated quality that, however, could be hampered by inappropriate net neutrality regulation. I don't want to go deeply in this issue because it is addressed in the afternoon and it is a very delicate issue, but just to say that regulation, the real point is to establish a demarcation between areas that should be addressed by public policy and governments and areas that should remain mostly driven by the private sector. A final remark, of course, discussion is welcome in order to decide the demarcation. A final remark, the evolution of the internet governance model needs to be carefully discussed among the different stakeholders. In this respect, we believe that the Internet Governance Forum plays a key role. It is, in fact, the ideal platform for debating how there may be improvements in order to create some direct relationship between national IGF, regional IGF, and global IGF. Second point, it is required that the content and the proposals discussed at the global forum, such this forum in Istanbul, are then shaped and framed in a matter that they can have a real impact, can be easily understood by the other players in the internet ecosystem. So not only a forum for debate, but also a forum for concrete proposals that should be presented in a better manner than today.
Very good. Thank you very much. May I ask now Lorenzo Pupillo to present the issues on behalf of Mira Buri, who unfortunately wasn't able to come at the last minute. As I mentioned, she has prepared a small expose on the different approaches and the way in which variable geometry has been applied in the WTO, which is quite interesting and shows the different approaches used in different areas. So, Lorenzo, thank you very much.
Yes. Okay. The World Trade Organization is the multilateral forum for regulating trade. The WTO has almost universal membership. Its rules have an unprecedentedly high level of legalization and are equipped with an effective quasi-judicial dispute settlement mechanism. From the organization's very outset, the legal design implementing the WTO agreement, which in their essence covers trading goods, GATT, services, GATT, and intellectual property rights protection, TRIPS, has not been uniform. The different agreements have responded to the challenges of equal treatment as an overarching goal in trade in fundamentally different ways. The General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, GATT, has been the farthest reaching in trying to reduce tariff and binding the domestic regulator hands to the mast so that other non-tariff barriers will not be erected. In contrast, the General Agreement for Trade and Services, GATT, reflects the philosophy of progressive liberalization. It allows members to tailor and pace the opening of the services market. In yet a third way, The WTO Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, TRIPS, has provided for minimal standards and a basic level of harmonization. These three core agreements and a number of other specific ones have been, however, equally binding upon all members, irrespective of level of trade flows, social and economic development. They've also been subject to the so-called single undertaking way of negotiating and moving forward, where changes in the treaties must be agreed upon as a whole. Despite these distinctive features of the WTO as an international organization, or perhaps partly because of them, it has suffered in recent years from insufficient political support from its membership, so as to allow its future-oriented development. This is palpable from the ongoing round of trade talks, the so-called Doha Development Agenda, which was launched in 2001, and despite the market goal of completing it by 2005, is still unfinished, and one may add stalling. The reasons behind this state of affairs are complex and have to do, on the one hand, with the changed political economy of international trade, as well as with the increased complexity of the issue talked, which clearly go beyond plain tariff reduction, but touch upon politically sensitive and controversial issues, such as development, climate change, and the fate of different communities. In a sense, many of the issues that are the WTO negotiation table today are not about trade, but about trade and issues. This is a state that is, by analogy, close to the present state of Internet governance debate, where the multiple repercussions of diverse technical decisions have been acknowledged and appropriate and comprehensive solutions appear still not found. Under such circumstances, and following the example of the WTO, it appears helpful to permit flexibility in the system, both in terms of tailoring the commitment of different countries, as well as in terms of allowing different members to go ahead at faster speed, while not precluding the others from joining in later. The so-called variable geometry is also politically well accepted and even often preached as the ultimate solution to present and persisting lock-ins, but it does come with certain negative effect and uncertainty attached. An important instrument in the variable geometry strategy have been the so-called plurilateral agreement. These allow for a speedier movement ahead on certain issues amongst like-minded nations, but bind only their signatories. An agreement in this sense, which also has been relevant for the evolution of the digital trade, is the Information Technology Agreement, ITA. It was agreed upon in 1996 and bound its members to reduce all tariffs for IT products to zero. While the ITS membership is smaller in numbers than the that of WTO, it managed to achieve a critical mass and cover, in effect, 97% of trade in IT products. Also interesting in terms of design, the ITA is not a closed but an open agreement that operates on MFN basis, which basically means that non-members can free ride on the concession made by ITA Club. A newer agreement presently under negotiation that is also on the plurilateral type, but unlikely to function on MFN basis, is the Trading Service Agreement. Plurilateral agreement, despite the relatively easy way of negotiation and possibly deeper commitment, as well as the achievement of some regulatory convergence within the club, admittedly cause also fragmentation within the entire system and may lead to serious disadvantage to non-members. Despite being associated with the WTO, such agreements have also been negotiated in secrecy, and in this sense must share the critique of other plurilateral deals stakeholders, such as the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, ACTA, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, TPP, for lack of transparency and proneness to lobbying. Overall, the WTO experience in diverse variable geometry model may offer valuable insight on existing and evolving model or going at different speed in different mode when trying to achieve common goals in global governance. One inherent feature of the system we should bear in mind when trying to translate some of the WTO experience into the global internet governance context is that the WTO is a conventional state-centered type of international organization. No other stakeholder but state have been represented, and the WTO itself has remained a state-driven venue without stronger agenda setting or managerial function or the organizational hub in Geneva.
Thank you very much. And now can I call on Professor Christopher Yu to talk about variable roles and dynamics in government processes.
Well, thank you for having me. This is a fascinating topic because variable geometry is an idea that's come out of international law, and it's really created a great way of rethinking what we're doing. What's really striking to me about variable geometry is we're used to thinking about the locus of decision as being decided in advance. That is, you're committed to a UN institution or you're committed to bilateral negotiations. What you see in variable geometry is your choice of decision-making venue becomes part of the strategy itself. A classic example of this happened with respect to the US strategy with intellectual property. It began in the World Intellectual Property Organization, which had a certain governance structure. They moved it to the GATT process and eventually got the trade-related aspects of intellectual property treaty out of it, TRIPS, which had WTO had a different decision-making structure, a different enforcement structure, and more importantly, the bargain was different because then the breadth of the TRIPS of the GATT negotiation allowed you to trade off intellectual property rights with access to agricultural markets. And this is and then you see the US would then move those negotiations to bilateral agreements and has largely moved away from TRIPS. And so what you start to see is different countries doing this strategically. The other big change that's been happening is two things. One is we're starting to see the impact of regionalism. And what we see is even within regionalism, we have various different venues. So here in Europe, we have the European Commission, of course, but we have different other institutions. We have the OECD vying as a possibility. We see the G7 now being replaced by the G20. And all of those different venues, the different actors are choosing to opt in and to allocate certain issues to each venue based on what they perceive to be their interests. And even the Council of Europe and other actors are entrepreneurially looking for ways to find their own role. So what you start to see, interestingly, is we're also seeing it shifting away from true intergovernmental organizations. One of the most important actors in the variable geometry space right now are standard-setting organizations. They have a different composition, they have a different decision-making process, but they are actually extremely influential. You see this in other areas such as stock markets, which are now as much governed by stock exchanges as they are by governments. And what you start to see is these rules happening and the fluidity of capital, people votes with its feet to find out what's going to be successful. And then another model, obviously, in the internet governance space is ICON. And so what we're seeing is all of this is up for grabs, and it has a number of very important implications. First, it reduces the importance of coercive force. Most of these situations arise in an area where there's no clear allocation of a decision maker. So what happens is you then have to attract people to your proposed venue. And this doesn't happen by using negative inducements, but usually typically by positive inducements. It also creates room for entrepreneurial leadership among countries that has broadened out the set of countries that lead and has led to a world in which you see different leaders in different sectors of of the economy where different countries take the leadership position and try to push it forward. And so what you start to see is a very different dynamic. Perhaps the best example in the internet governance space is Net Mundial and Brazil's efforts and tremendous success in creating a venue that did a new variable geometry venue that did not exist before, and are trying to institutionalize it into something more regular and in ways that right now we can't even anticipate exactly what will happen to that. So the structure is quite fluid. It allows people to move into the space a lot more easily, and it does change the dynamics of what you have to do to get people to join you in the space that you're trying to lead. It becomes much more about attracting people to follow you and inducing people as opposed to trying to find a way to coerce them in. So what does that mean? You need the cooperation of others. I actually think in a multi-stakeholder space like the IGF, there's a particular set of problems where you need not just government-led initiatives, but the cooperation of private companies. Because in fact, anyone who can look at the internet build-out today will tell you that it will be financed by private corporations, not by governments. Simply put, the public funding is not there. And so what you need to do, oddly enough, is worry about how attractive the proposition you're putting in front of people who don't necessarily share your interests. Because if you actually create a solution, but none of the companies actually finance the build-out, it simply won't occur. And so it's very strange. It's what you often see in negotiations that begin as adversarial. You need to understand the interest of the other party. One of the most interesting comments I heard in the Net Mundial discussion earlier this week, someone said, this is great talking to each other, but we all are supporting it. What do we have to do to attract the countries who are currently opposed to that framework and get into a conversation with them to try to make that change? And that is a spirit that's very much consistent with the multi-stakeholder approach in the IGF. And it's one that I think that we lose sometimes. And it's a fundamentally different engagement. Instead of the typical international negotiations of interest analysis, it's going to be a much more dynamic and much more cooperative idea where you have to understand what your opponents or what the other people you're negotiating really is motivating them. And the last question I would say is decision-making rules matter in terms of the venue choice. And so what I think is that what I would ask everyone is basically to live the spirit of the IGF. One of the things that private companies have to do is stay engaged. It's very easy, and actually in many early years of the IGF, the private companies were not that engaged. And in fact, if this will only work is if people cooperate in that venture. But at other times, I've seen other segments, whether it's civil society or governments, everyone has to actually believe that they need the cooperation of all the other actors in order to make a particular venue for decision-making important. And what that means is that instead of worrying about your own interests exclusively, you have to think about it as a collective solution about how you get people to cooperate in. And in that sense, I think that it is a fundamental change in what we're doing. And in that sense, the Internet Governance Forum has a chance to play a very distinctive role in this space.
Thank you very much. Just on the Net Mundial point, I thought it was perhaps useful, I was going to raise it somewhere else, but since you've raised it, I thought it would be useful to quote to you from the multi-stakeholder statement from Net Mundial on an aspect relating to variable geometry, an interpretation anyway. It says, respective roles and responsibilities of stakeholders should be interpreted in a flexible manner with reference to the issue under discussion. So it's quite clear also in the Net Mundial stakeholder statement that this aspect should be brought into consideration. So, thank you very much. Next, Olga Cavalli, could you tell us your perspective from the variable geometry approach and whether and how it fits the government's role?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation and for setting up this interesting panel. I come from a region that is really diverse. It's Latin America. Latin America, of course, it's a very nice region. Unique because of the diversity of the countries that compose the region. There are very small island countries, medium-sized countries, and big economies like Brazil, and medium-sized economies like other countries. So the multi-stakeholder approach and multi-stakeholder model is challenging somehow for our region. Also, the problems that our region has are unique. We are a region where we have big differences in between who have the rich and the poor. The big gap is in Latin America, and that's extremely challenging for governments. And we think that internet and the ICTs could be an interesting tool to close this gap and to bring our countries into the development world and to make people learn more and participate more. So in this scenario, and it was also said during the Net Mundial meeting in the paper that Argentina presented about the role of stakeholders. We believe that the governments have a relevant role. It's not one more stakeholder. Governments have the role of law enforcement, of making regulations. There are many things that are in hands of the private sector and some other organizations, but at the same time, they must be regulated and reviewed by governments at the local level. So this makes it more challenging for governments in their role and the accountability they have for the citizens and for the local economy. At the same time, this diversity in the region makes it more challenging for the coordination. So what governments have been trying in facing this multi-stakeholder challenge that we are going through, especially through years before, I would say that ICANN was the first step that we had to face through this multi-stakeholder coordination. So we started to do some coordination at the regional level. We do have a regional plan of action that came after, a little before the second phase of WSIS in 2005. Then it was consolidated in WSIS. And it's an action plan that we review every 2 years. Now it will be reviewed again in 2015. And we will have a preparatory meeting this year in 2014. So what we have done in this plan is to agree in some things that we want to achieve at the regional level, which, as I said, is not easy because it's a very diverse region. One thing that we included in this working plan is the focus towards internet governance, and it's a group coordinated by Brazil and Argentina, and there we try to gather, as from a multi-stakeholder perspective, all the problems and views from other countries of the region. Also, the challenge is to include other countries of our region into the process. Urgencies in Latin America sometimes makes governments think that this internet governance process and multi-stakeholder model is something that they can think about, but not as a first priority. So what we are trying to bring is more participation, more relevant participation from all the countries of the region through this regional plan of action and this group of this working group on internet governance. We also have a regional IGF since 2008. It has been growing steadily, and it's a point of reference for our regional coordination in relation with internet. One example of regional coordination has been the GAC of ICANN. We have been growing in the number of representatives from the region, and last year with the new GTLDs process, we had some challenges. Some names of our regions and rivers were taken as future new GTLDs, and so that brought us some challenges in respect of respecting these names for our governments and for our countries. But that made us position and our work in the GAC more strong. More countries came to the GAC, less Peru and Chile, and they coordinated with some of us that were already working there. So I would say that the GAC of ICANN has been one point of first coordination for the region in relation with the multi-stakeholder model. Also about capacity building, there are several things that have been done in the region to include. If you look at the statistics, the participation of Latin America in all these processes is less even than Africa. There are many reasons for that. It's language, it's the cost of traveling, and it's the cost of opportunity, but also sometimes it's the lack of information that you have to make the decision of going for all stakeholders. So I am part of a project which is called South School of Internet Governance. We have trained more than 600 professionals so far from all the countries of Latin America, including the Caribbean. Caribbean and South America integration and Latin America integration is challenging because of language and the culture. So that has been going very well. And finally, and so not taking so much time, I would stress the fact that the governments have a special role as stakeholders. They are not one stakeholder more. They have a major role in, as I said, in law enforcement and also in regulations. And there are many things that are done by private sector, like, for example, peering traffic agreements and some other things. But always the government and regulations has to look at the big picture for the wealth of the country, and coordination in the region also is relevant. I will stop here. Maybe there are some questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we take questions from the audience, let's finish with the last three panelists. So first, may I ask Professor Ni Quaynor from Ghana to give us the perspective from the technical community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm still looking for the geography. I mean, I'm looking for the geometry and the variables to understand, but nonetheless, I'll offer a few comments. It's pretty difficult to speak on behalf of the technical community because it's still quite varied, but I'll give you a certain opinion. From my thinking, multi-stakeholder is more an approach. And therefore, every community is likely to adapt aspects of it to enable it to address and solve its problems. Now, to me, the motivation is that problems are becoming more complex, and sometimes problems may even be undecidable, generally, but one can narrow the complexity and derive some solutions. So it requires expertise, and it does require varied disciplines, very varied disciplines. That way, then you can have a hope of deriving a much more robust solution. So in the approach, I assume that anyone who joins the community to address a particular problem accepts a common goal. That means that you leave behind your stakeholdership, or you bring your stakeholdership in as a value, not as a deterrent, not as a polarizing thing, because you have a common goal. That's very important. I expect that the process will indeed be bottom-up, meaning that whatever the leadership is, don't really decide things. They encourage the community to narrow down options and so forth. I expect that stakeholders will gravitate towards problems as opposed to say these problems are for these stakeholders. I expect that there will be varied disciplines participating in the process, and the process must be open enough so that the next 3 billion, 4 billion coming can join. So if it is closed, then some of us from developing countries will indeed be left out in some of these decisions. I assume that there will be clear documentation which is public, and usually there are different types of documentation depending on what the intention is. Sometimes it's merely for information, sometimes it's trying to address specific issues, and so on. And there is evolution of these documents, meaning what may be informational, depending on how it is adopted, might become something much more stronger or standard, depending on how you look at it. I also, now I'd like to make a comment on the governance side of things, just to wrap it up. I'm on the assumption that the leadership is voluntary and depends on the subject matter. As different stakeholders gravitate towards a problem, it becomes evident who are actually the best people to address the problems, because you can see in the passion and the issues that they raise. So let it happen organically. Usually there is a search, group of sorts to help look out for interested parties who could be chairs of groups and so forth. And that's typically the non-com that you may hear mentioned in the technical committee. There may be some selection thereafter, if need be. I expect that these subgroups addressing issues would be organized in a self-organized manner, not mandated that you're going to solve this problem. Usually that doesn't work. But if an issue comes up and people are showing interest, then they can address it. And the leader, e.g. the chair, his focus is to determine whether there is sufficient understanding, there is sufficient consensus. In our environment, we are looking for rough consensus and running code, meaning that we are looking for what people can live with and what works. We cannot take risks. Okay, so those are very important. And decisions are really by the larger community, not by the handful who have met here. We cannot decide anything here and necklace the rest of the community. So if we make any strong commitments to issues here, we need to take it to a larger community to get them also to buy in. I mean, this is the nature of the multi-stakeholder approach. And usually there are things like comments periods. There are things like last call, so that everybody gets a chance to make a point. Now, in conclusion, perhaps there has not been enough application of the multi-stakeholder approach, maybe not well documented, although there are some documentation around. And so there's a lot to be learned by studying how the different communities have addressed this particular issue. And, it is my hope that norms will be noted after this kind of study, and in the process, we will be able to maybe generalize a little bit more the approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Sally Costerton, perhaps you can give us the perspective from the point of view of ICANN.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. When I first met Lorenzo to talk about this, it was actually in, I think, February, back in the GSMA's Congress in Barcelona. And we both found ourselves, I think, astonished that we appeared to be working on almost exactly the same project. At the time, ICANN was involved in the early stages of preparing what became the ILVS panel on global internet cooperation and governance mechanisms. And this was chaired by President Thomas Ilves and co-chaired by Vint Cerf. And it met 3 times during the early part of the year. And when Lorenzo and I first met, it was in its early drafting stages. And at the time, he said to me, "I want to explain to you about variable geometry." And I thought, that's kind of a funny word. Maybe it's an Italian thing. Maybe it sounds different. Maybe it means something different in Italian, I thought to myself. But I was very polite, and I said that, yes, okay. And I was working on the first drafts of the decentralized proposal, the proposal for a decentralized, collaborative internet governance processes that we would be participating in as ICANN, that would allow us to use multi-stakeholder principles that my co-panelists have talked about. And I was very struck by an observation that when I came into ICANN 2 years ago, and we went to the Wicket in Dubai, there was a public perception that the internet community and the telecoms community just didn't agree. Just different animals. And that morning in that meeting room in Barcelona, I looked at Lorenzo and I thought, I'm not so sure I agree with that. And so it turned out, because in the intervening months, the ILVS panel submitted its early recommendations into the Net Mundial proposal, exactly as Telecom Italia did with variable geometry, and Olga did. From many of you in the room will have been there and were involved in it. And as the months went past, it certainly became more obvious to me that we were all really talking about pretty much the same thing. And so from ICANN's perspective, of course, it was never a very difficult concept for us, because ICANN, in a way, it is variable geometry. I mean, it is all the time. That is its kind of lifeblood. And my team, I look after stakeholder engagement at ICANN. And that is very literally what my team does around the world. It engages with different groups of stakeholders, variable groups, with different perspectives. It is not ICANN's goal to kind of coalesce those groups in any way, particularly. It is ICANN's role to facilitate and understand, and sometimes to try to bring people together to resolve issues. For sure, as we've been through the new GTLD process, we have had much hands-on experience. To quote my colleague over here's point of view, we have to see the other person's point of view. We have had to learn good facilitation skills. We need better ones. But establishing variable geometry, decentralized, collaborative processes, whatever term you use, is as much, I think, at ICANN about human skills, people skills, as it is about technology or protocols or legal issues or financial issues. And the progress, honestly, that I think has been made in the level of confidence, even having this panel, that so many of us from such different backgrounds can say such similar things, is incredibly encouraging. And I really would champion Telecom Italia for taking public leadership. In terms of what can we do apart from congratulate each other, which is always nice, I would make one plea, and I think that many have said this and many will continue to say this. If we can reach a point, and I think we might be nearly there, where we all broadly think we're talking about much the same thing, that's tremendous progress. That's, if you will, the kind of content side of it, not an internet content, I mean the subject matter. We have some principles. We have. The IGF has been espousing wonderful bottom-up, multi-stakeholder principles of engagement since its inception. The Sao Paulo principles deeply endorse that. The ILVS panel called for action around that. I don't think there'll be anybody at the IGF who would disagree with that desire to operate in the future with those principles. So we have achieved a lot. But what we don't have yet is a very widespread understanding outside our internet community as to how to implement some of these ideas, how to take the next step. And perhaps that is partly to do with the lack of familiarity. And my colleague over here, Mr. Yu, made this point. These are new techniques. They are unfamiliar. They are not part of the kind of body memory of how we make international treaties, how we build international organizations. They require us to take a leap. And sometimes to start, as Ni was saying, do you know, from first principles, okay, what can we live with? You know, what works? What can we start with? Where can we begin? Where do we bite into this? And perhaps kind of really support each other to leave aside our natural, if I will, kind of engineering-based instincts, which are, I must understand everything before I can begin to implement anything. And I fear that if we don't collectively and in partnerships with each other around the world, and I'm not sure that it matters terribly much where you start, either in topic or in country. It doesn't matter. There should be many pathways, many platforms. And the IGF is a marvelous place to pull those together, to see the common threads and to come together, both here globally, but also at regional IGFs. And I certainly commit ICANN to both helping to promote these concepts. I think this is the other piece. It's partly behaving creatively and being brave and trying and starting, but it's also being very realistic that there are many millions of people literally around the world who can contribute, who don't necessarily originate in the internet community, who can teach us and help us. And whether it's through the processes, even quite practical issues like handling the oversight, the IANA stewardship transition, I must get that precisely right, which, of course, many of you in the ICANN community are aware is quite a big part of life for us. How do we make sure that we espouse these principles and we take our own medicine? So I thank you for the opportunity. I really look forward to working with all of you as we take these concepts forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sally. And then our last speaker, but not least, of course, is Antonio Preto, who will give us the perspective from that of the national regulators' point of view, I think.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Telecom Italia, Giovanni Amendola, Lorenzo Pupillo for the invitation. It's the first time for me to the IGF, so I'm trying to understand which kind of animal IGF is from the perspective of a national regulator, having had also a long-standing experience at the European Union level. The argument is very intriguing, I think, because in my previous experience, in my previous life in the European Union, we were used to work with variable geometry. And the variable geometry is maybe the only way we can progress in the integration of the European Union. Take for example, euro is one example of variable geometry, but we can make several examples. So variable geometry is a very interesting idea, and I think that the way we can really progress in a more effective governance of internet. So I fully share this approach and this idea, and I think that my colleagues, they have just spoken, they are all of them from different perspectives on this line. I think that there is one more issue, that with variable geometry, with this approach, we can reach a very crucial target, because through different responsibilities and the differentiation of responsibilities in the internet governance, we can strike a balance between a wide participation, which is a basic principle of the internet governance, and the effective implementation. Of course, most have already been said, so I will try to concentrate myself on the most hidden points. Those they have been missing, according to my opinion, till now. And I will, of course, introduce in the debate my experience as Commissioner of a National Regulatory Authority. Internet is an ever-changing ecosystem. Since its beginning, it has grown massively, mainly due to the network neutrality and the lack of a top-down control. The multi-stakeholder model has resulted to be the best archetypal to view the internet, permitting the standardization process and the development of protocols in private hands. The internet governance is the brain of such a model. And as the role of internet in our society and economies has changed so radically, its governance has become much more delicate and complex in the meantime. New technical and social issues are at stake, and this is bringing towards a new general architecture. Consequently, the current multi-stakeholder model may be improved and enhanced, as mentioned yesterday by Neelie Kroes, Vice President of the European Commission, in his intervention. As a regulator, and I ask myself, should the governance allow the presence of regulators? I'm convinced that the private model is a value we must preserve. Private evolution of the internet tells us about freedom and pure development. At the same time, private intervention is not all there is to say about Internet governance. At the very beginning, the engineers and technical experts, and some of them are here, which gave birth to the net operated under the umbrella of public administration, the ARPA. Why I refer to this element? Just to indicate that public and private have cooperated since the origin of the Internet. This is even more important nowadays. This cooperation is more important nowadays. Internet governance is becoming as much complex as critical. The issues at stake are now heterogeneous and complex, multifaceted, thus requiring for focus and prompt solution. I just mentioned two important issues. The right to be forgotten after the decision of the European Court of Justice on the Google case, and the protection of copyright or fight against piracy on internet. In this context, an element which is still laying behind the curtain is the role of the national regulators. And I strongly believe that a clear role for the regulators could introduce a new form of expertise in the definition of core principles at the global level. Regulators derive their experience from adherent sectors like electronic communication, allocation of scarce resources, and here my friends of telecom, they know quite well the role of national regulators in that respect. As the borders of the sectors tend to blur, and we have just spoken about the interaction between telecommunication and internet, the overall debate on the overall multi-stakeholder model could benefit from the experience of the regulators. Regulators foster competition, but they are aimed at assuring individual rights. So we have both as national regulators, competition and individual rights. We are an administration, but we are neutral and independent. We operate under the rule of law and the principle of legality, but we do not bring element of rigidity because a regulation is based on flexible cohesion and the legal, economic, and technical expertise, and is based on a very large stakeholder participation. From the beginning, it means from the conception of the rules we introduce, very large consultations, till the implementation of rules, because in many respects we call all the stakeholders to take part in committees which are consulted, which they can provide very large and very deep suggestion on how we can implement, how we have to implement or eventually to amend our rules. I make, for example, the recent case of our regulation on copyright protection. Of course, we have to avoid any kind of overlapping, and because we consider that the separation of tasks is fundamental in any complex ecosystem. I have few time available, so I try to conclude. I have just said that how the system of national regulators involves very much the participation of the stakeholders, and also is adapt to a variable geometry, because you can take account of the issues and of the geography, as mentioned before by Giovanni Amendola. So we avoid any centralized control or entity. Telecom Italia proposes to set up a multi-stakeholder committee in charge of assigning the governance issues to different institutions. I agree with this general view. Nonetheless, I would like to make quite a different proposal. Let's think about ICANN. It has been defined as a hybrid organization by legal scholars. This particular nature has been identified in the presence of the GAC, which brings the public side in an organization that is internationalized, private, and based on self-government. If this is true, the government's view is already present in the debate. Is this enough? In my opinion, the answer is negative, because we need the presence of independent authorities, different and separated from political powers. This is the crucial role of an independent authorities. We represent and we are called to enforce the public interest, but we are separated from the political powers. This is the difference and the justification of our role. So our voice must be added in the system, and the system will be a hybrid model inside a hybrid model, like ICANN we have just said. I've closed my intervention. I remind how in the variable geometry, regulators can contribute in a flexible way, defining some core principles like net neutrality or the access to the infrastructure, which is the logical preliminary issues to the use of the internet. I conclude really now. I believe that public should not crush the private. I believe that the public institution, like the independent authorities, can intervene in the debate in order to preserve some aspect of the public interest, those I have mentioned, which cannot be left aside. It's a perspective of integration and not of mutual exclusion. So I think at the end that the role of the national regulatory authorities, independent and neutral, can be the right answer to the main question and the main issue that Commissioner Cruz put yesterday on the table. It means that the governance of this multi-stakeholder governance, which is quite interesting, important, and has to be preserved on one hand. On the other hand, must grant transparency and user rights. And has to also to grant the basic principles of ICANN: security, stability, and resilience. I think that the national regulatory authorities, with their independence, their expertise, are the best place to grant such kind of principles and to give the right response to the issues that Mrs. Cruz put yesterday on the table. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Okay, there are a whole series of issues that have been raised. It's clear, I think, that the differences between the issues and the geography and the relative interests and roles of different stakeholders are very much at stake. Some of you have proposed, and I think this is a very good one, the reinforcement of regional and national IGFs to bring in more actors at local level to identify issues specific to those regions and those areas. Governments, of course, can help very much in this by encouraging these activities, by participating, by helping to fund. So there you have already a whole series of aspects that can help in that particular respect. And I would like you, in your comments, to think about that and whether this workshop should come out with some specific proposals in that regard, and also on best practices in how to introduce variable geometry in the IGF process on technical issues, on legal issues, on other aspects, how we should approach this variable geometry in terms of what are some good best practices that could be generated by this workshop and that we could identify. I think that would help also to concretize, it's not a very good English word, but to put into action some of the good ideas that have been raised here. So I open the discussion to the floor. If you have specific questions or comments, please identify yourself as well. And I think there's a microphone over here. Excuse me. Yes, did you see him at the front? Oops, here we are. And then we'll go, yes, to you.
Sorry?
Try again.
Thank you very much for all the interventions and the interesting aspects which have been addressed. My main plea would be to try to structure the discussion.
It's gone off, I think. The light was on a minute ago, but now it's gone off. Perhaps if you hold it closer to your mouth. No, that's it.
My plea would be to try to structure the discussion a little bit more detailed way, because variable geometry can have various meanings, and a couple of meanings have been addressed by the panelists. We have the geographic variable geometry. In my opinion, that's a very valid path, and I would even think that's the easiest path. The geographic variable geometry corresponds to well-known traditional principles, in particular the subsidiarity principle. If something can be done on a lower level, it should not be moved up to a higher level. What can be done within national, regional IGFs, etc., should not be moved up to the IGF. But then we have two other and different kinds of variable geometry, namely the substantive and the personal variable geometry. We would have to identify for which areas or for which markets a variable geometry is appropriate, and for which areas and for which markets variable geometry is not appropriate. There are, of course, a dozen or even more different areas which we can identify. I would, for example, assume that for cybersecurity issues, we need a relatively high level of harmonization and agreement or legal interoperability. If we look at culture, we would probably need less harmonization. And this is intertwined with the personal aspect. In some areas, it is hardly imaginable that civil society can play a major role, for example, in cybersecurity. However, in other areas, civil society must play a major role in culture, for example, in education, etc. And this could lead to some kind of chart in which we would have to define the concrete substantive topic, and we could then link the participation of the different stakeholder groups to the topics.
Thank you very much. I think we are all saying something quite similar to what you have said as well, by distinguishing the issues, distinguishing the geography, and some issues, as you rightly say, are at such a high level that they have to be addressed everywhere. But we can always start at the local level too. There was a question right at the back here, or a comment.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Hi. Hello, everyone. I'm Christine. I represent the Danish government, and I would like to thank the panel for this interesting perspective and analysis and tackling the slightly unapproachable subject of variable geometry. My question would be, or I would like the panel, particularly Professor Yo, to reflect perhaps a little bit more on the intergovernmental organization versus the multi-stakeholder or private organization in the internet governance environment. I like very much the perspective of trying to attract decision makers in a positive way to your venue or your organization as opposed to coercion or forcing them there. But the matter of the fact is that an intergovernmental organization will be able to force a decision. For example, in an ITU setting, if a country wants to propose something, and if there is a majority, even with a consensus, negotiation, and so forth, ultimately you have a risk of it's a one country, one vote setting, and you will risk having a binding outcome. And even though maybe if this outcome is not something that the multi-stakeholders or the relevant stakeholders will agree with or will adopt or will even recognize, there is a sort of a risk. I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's a risk of a sort of salami method, if you understand what I mean, that you sort of slice your way into an area, for instance, internet governance. So I wanted to sort of ask the panel to reflect on what that does for a dynamic within sort of a variable geometry setting.
Thank you very much. Professor Yu, would you like to?
So I would say, I actually think the ITU is the perfect example, but I would be, based on principles of international law, a little bit more reserved about their ability to come to definitive decisions. The example I would give is the wicket. You have treaties. People only participate by consent. We had a treaty emerge from that was signed by 80-some countries. Significant constituency, Western Europe, North America, Japan, Australia didn't sign.
And some developing countries.
And some developing, and large numbers of different parts of the world with different reasons chose not to sign. And so this is an example to me about how governments naturally look to intergovernmental organizations thinking they're very comfortable getting definitive resolutions. And it often doesn't happen if the underlying interests aren't there. What I'm discovering is the reason governments are so uncomfortable with variable geometry, and they're very comfortable with multilateral organizations, is they get to set agendas, only governments speak, they're used to having a very structured environment. And it's a very uncomfortable place watching very senior government officials walking around here and sitting in the audience at the dance last night, the dance exhibition, with the rest of us. It's interesting for them. The flip side I see is civil society has enjoyed a long period of benign neglect from government. And I hear them wishing for a day where that could be like that again. And they have to understand those days are gone. There's too much money, there's too much security, there's too many interests involved, and that we need to kind of come to a middle ground. But the thing that I always think about really is to come back to the idea of the metaphor I have in my mind is partly the wicket. What happens when people don't consent? Standard setting organizations set standards all the time, hundreds of them that are ignored. And that in fact, unless it makes it individually rational for people to adhere to a standard or a decision or consent in, it will be a tree falling in the forest with nobody there. Now, what makes it so hard to me is we have the ITU as a venue, we have now Mundial as a venue, we have here.
And I think there are two requirements of that. One is that it has to be quite analytical or analytically capable to present the arguments that induce people to engage in it. And in that respect, it also often needs to be quite data capable. It needs to be able to get a lot of data to show how it can work. Secondarily, I think that when you have a variability of geometry of the different actors, as in a multi-stakeholder model, you actually also need to have quite clear allocations of responsibilities. What exactly is the responsibility of a government department or a regulator vis-a-vis the private sector actors that might be involved and the different kinds of private sector actors? Because if you don't have that clarity at the start, and that can often be a matter of dispute about what the responsibilities of those actors are. But if you don't have it, what you end up with at the end, or you can be in danger of ending up, is a very unclear result in terms of responsibility. And that means that the result can actually undermine what you originally wanted it to achieve.
Thank you. Well, as I said, in trying to very grossly summarize the many comments and the very rich contributions from the panelists, I think at local level, and this was mentioned already, the importance of the bottom-up approach and the local approach, addressing particular issues that have local, regional, national interests, and then bringing them towards the overall international IGF, multi-stakeholder IGF. That helps to identify the specific problems, the specific issues, and bring them together so that you see how this variable geometry works, and then you bring it together at international level. That might be an approach, but we're obviously not going to solve all the problems today. Do you want to? Antonio?
Yes.
Okay.
I think. Okay, sorry. Our chair has already put our response on the right track, because I think that being the internet governance a bottom-up system, we cannot now move from a bottom-up to a top-down. So it means that we need here to understand which are the cases, the specific issue they have to be dealt at national, local, national, regional level, and those, they need a more global approach. So it will be, quite a case-by-case approach, according to the single problems, issues have to be tackled. Of course, there is always the temptation of the states to try to isolate their own areas of sphere of influence from the rest, trying to impose their rules. But I think that with internet it will be not a real successful exercise at the end. Of course, the public institution must be fully involved, but they have to understand that they have to understand that they have to play a different role here. And I've mentioned the example of AGCOM in the case of trying to create some instrument to fight against piracy. We have consulted so largely all people interested, and we have asked them, do you think that AGCOM has the power to do it according to the European Union directives, according to the national legal system and the rules? So we start from the scratch. So this is a really different issue. Internet governance is not like business as usual. It's completely different. So including the public institution have to completely change their approach. So here we are not in the telecom sector that we have in the electronic communication sector. Here we are in the internet, which has a community and which has a multi-stakeholder governance, which has developed very well, and we are here just for that reason. So we have to take account of different aspects.
Okay, thank you. And then
a very short comment, because I completely share the viewpoint expressed by Commissioner Preto. we need to preserve the bottom-up nature of the Internet governance. This bottom-up nature is already by nature based and framed on the variable geometry concept. So we have advocated and presented this theoretical approach, and we are of course aware that this is a theoretical approach, and it is to be implemented, and the implementation is already in place. We say that we need to preserve the current multi-stakeholder model based already on the variable geometry concept, and on that ground we need to improve it. Of course, one could prefer a system whereby some super regulators or super multinational body decides that issue A is to be addressed by country X, Y, and Z, whilst issue B should be addressed by the private sector, and particularly some companies rather than others. But I mean, this dirigistic system theoretically would work, but it is unpractical. It is impossible to end up with this kind of overall authority deciding and allocating in the world the different issues to different stakeholders. So this is not possible. We need to continue with the bottom-up model, and this is because we believe that the IGF is essential in this process. It may be a bit frustrating that at the end we do not have a conclusion of the like, okay, we have everybody agreed that this issue should be addressed by some stakeholders, and the votes should be framed in this way, and so on. This is not possible. In my opinion, we should continue with the current system, but we can improve it, and the best approach is to improve the IGF.
Good. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, oh, but you wanted to speak as well. I'm very sorry. Why don't you go ahead, because...
brief. I just want to agree with him that linking stakeholders to problem means that somebody is acting like God. And in a bottom-up multi-stakeholder environment, I think the preferred thing is that let people, stakeholders, gravitate towards the problem, and then you get the enthusiasm and support you need.
Yeah, and they usually can identify solutions as well, which is very useful. So may I suggest that I think there are a number of very good ideas that have come out of the workshop. Perhaps it's useful for the organizers of the workshop, not the moderator, to, if possible, write down some of the very useful ideas that have come out and throw them into the batch as best practices that could potentially be considered as part of the outcome of the IGF, if you agree. I think it could be useful, because it's a pity not to let others see the ideas that come out of these things, and then we will be consistent with Net Mundial and with the recommendations on the improvement of IGF on identifying actions and activities that can come out of IGF and be carried forward in the future. So thank you all very much for participating. Thank you very much to all the panelists for your excellent contributions. And I look forward to seeing you all in the next few days. Thank you.
Hello, testing. Hi, just a heads up for those in the room, we're having an informal roundtable starting at 1 o'clock. So if you're here for that, that's cool. If you're not, just FYI, there's another meeting starting here in a few minutes. Okay. Yeah, you can stay, but we're all going to be here, so you might need to go to the back of the room or something, that's all. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Sorry, I need to check because I'm worried. Hi, Susan. Hi. It's okay. Please. Good. I'm not quite. Susan.
We're just kind of gathering around for this.
The That's the one that looks like God. It's right. Very strange.
I just sent Producer Nicholas very kindly offered to go down to the bilateral room 6